Paul, how you going?
Doing as good as anyone can in this world.
Yeah. Hey, I got a bunch of stuff. You'll notice that I'm fully branded compared to last time we spoke.
Yeah,
Um, this,
three three balls in a circle.
yeah, the symbol's called the Quen. It's the symbol that I ascribe to the Anthropocene epoch.
uh,
And
To the
so
what
it's,
processing people?
what's that?
To which processing people?
The Anthropocene.
Oh, the Anthropocene.
The
Yeah,
Anthropocene, yeah.
it's
Yeah.
a picture of three drains, I hope, because that's what the Anthropocene represents.
three three sewage pipes.
Yeah.
Actually, I'll tell you the symbolism. The lower two rings represent the biosphere and human civilization, and the outer ring represents a sort of continuum. But the continuum's broken because of the relationship between the humans and the living planet. That's the symbolism of it. So,
No.
so this
Uh,
is part of Vita Sapien, which you can see
yeah.
named there. And so Vita Sapien is an attempt to sort of approach the climate and ecological crisis through spirituality, not woo-woo and crystals, but just through that deeper understanding of meaning that people have for their lives. So some
Well,
people see meaning in money making. They're going to behave differently if they have a meaning that sees themselves as part of nature.
we started out. Our big success came from being cooperative and having empathy.
Yeah.
And now we're mostly looking at our cell phones, not cooperating. And certainly in the US, at least, although you've had examples in Australia, not very big on empathy.
No, exactly. Selfism and focus on a spiritual connection to consumerism and personal wealth and things. Yeah, so that's what the brand Vita Sapiens about. Is just trying to approach the climate and ecological crisis, but using spirituality as a frame of reference. One of our little principles is this idea that, and this is not a piece of science per se, but more of spiritual belief, that all the living things on the planet are effectively a single organism. Now,
Well,
there's
it's a superorganism view.
superorganism, yeah. A term that I like to use, and this is just me liking fancy words, is omni-holobiont. I kind of put those two things together. A holobiont being like an assemblage of organisms.
Uh,
And so,
yeah, go on.
the omni it sort of suggests the all. So it's the entire assemblage of all of these organisms to create a single. Does that make sense biologically, or am I just making stuff up here?
A mix.
A mix.
In other words, yeah, no, biologists think a lot about ecosystems and communities, and anybody who thinks about Homo sapiens, badly misnamed, I have to say,
Absolutely. Yeah.
that a single individual means nothing. In other words, people can only really exist in cooperative groups.
Yeah.
So it makes a lot of sense that way. It doesn't mean you're physically fused, but your fates are permanently fused.
Yeah, the fates are intertwined. Yeah. So I went through this thought exercise. If we were to assume, not so much biologically, but spiritually, that all the living things on the planet were a single organism, that makes us humans cells in a body. And then the question is, what is the name of that organism? What would be the binomial for the single organism that makes up all the life on Earth? And
Well,
my
you
name for
got to
that,
go back a little bit in scale, because of course you may have more bacterial cells in you than human cells.
yeah,
So you're already a composite of numerous life forms. You have not just bacterial cells,
yeah,
you've got undoubtedly fungal cells and certainly viruses
yeah,
and so on. Some of them can do you harm,
yeah,
and some of them can do you good.
yeah.
The I probably shouldn't put this in your podcast, but we're studying what happens when populations go extinct,
Yeah,
working with two colleagues on that problem. And one of the best examples we have comes from the overuse of antibiotics, which can kill off a lot of the helpful bacteria in your gut. And when you kill them off, a nasty bacterium called Clostridium difficile is able to invade.
Right.
And if it invades, it can kill you. And it's very difficult to get rid of because it's developed resistance to most of the antibiotics. And in fact, the standard treatment now, if the antibiotics fail, is a fecal transplant. You get feces from somebody else that reintroduces the populations of helpful bacteria that originally kept the difficile out.
Yeah, right.
So it may sound nasty, but we're learning more and more about what those gut bacteria do for you. And there's even what's now called a gut-brain connection. And the neurotransmitters that are produced in your gut can change your moods and so on. It's getting to be very interesting, very complicated, and makes us look less and less like separate entities.
Yeah. Which lends further sort of weight to the idea that everything combined forms a organism, super organism of its own. Hey, I wanted to talk to you also about a couple of things. Firstly, human population. I was just looking at a human population clock a moment ago. I might just bring that up on the screen because it's quite telling. Where is that? I don't know where that is.
You got more faith in Zoom than I have.
Yeah, that's right. I'm going to need to go and just activate something. Stand by a second there. If I go and here we go, population. Actually, let's not do that because I had a screen up that actually had like a counter running and it was showing something like 160 million births a year and around, no, this is year to date, so this is total, righto. So we've got around about 90 million extra human beings on the planet every year at the moment, right? And so my question is, are we seeing that our human growth is actually starting to, the rate of population growth is starting to slow because the pressure is ramping up from all of these climate disasters and heat waves and all of the pressures on humans? Are we actually starting to see the human population growth start to slow yet?
Well, we are seeing some slowing, particularly in developed countries. Some of them are going to start shrinking, are actually starting shrinking. But of course, there's a huge potential for growth. But the biggest problem is 8 billion people are many more than the planet can support permanently. We are living on our capital, and every scientist who doesn't have to take off his or her shoes to count up to 20 knows that virtually every single existential problem we're facing is connected with having too many people. And I'm a very social guy. I love people. I actually am charmed by babies. But if you want to have a maximum number of people live, what you want to have is a smaller population that goes on for many millions of years, rather than try and cram as many people into the planet as you can now until it just busts. And every single colleague I have thinks a collapse of civilization is in the cards. And if you look at, well, of course, many years ago, Gandhi was asked what he thought about Western civilization. And he said he thought it would be a good idea. And as you can see in the United States today, dramatically, but you've seen in Australia, having thugs run the country and be powerful is not a way to have a nice, cooperative, empathetic society. And we're pretty depressed here.
Where do the best world population numbers come from? Is that coming out of the UN?
The best, I think, are the Population Reference Bureau, which builds on the UN statistics, but the UN statistics have in the past had some problems from the fact that they have to accept the numbers given by governments.
Right.
And governments tend to Mickey Mouse around with the numbers, just like if you're going around asking leaders of say states how many people they have. If they want more aid, they're likely to inflate the figures. And if they think too many people is causing a pandemic, they're likely to reduce the figures. So the Population Reference Bureau, which you can find by Googling it, has some very good demographers who try and take into account some of those little political moves. And I think do a pretty good job of it. Their projections have been quite good in the past.
Okay.
And at least they're doing it as scientifically as you can, considering the sources of data.
Yeah. And that number at the moment assumes around about 7.9 billion.
Yes, I think it's November. They're going to take us through the 8 billion mark.
Right.
The most recent estimate of how many people might be supported in the long term at, say, roughly a Mexican standard of living, an intermediate standard of consumption, was Partha Dasgupta, who's the best economist on the planet at Cambridge University, Sir Partha, actually. And he did a huge study for the British government, and he's been working on it hard. And his estimate came up with you might support 3 billion people in the long term, which is not far. Ann and I and Gretchen Daly, one of our colleagues, estimated 1.5 billion, leaving some room for mistakes. But the basic point is nobody who's looked at it closely doesn't think we have too many now. So the issue is, how do we start humanely shrinking the size of the population? And that'll give us a lot of time to figure out where the shrinkage should stop.
Do the in the projections from the United Nations on human population, are they tying in with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and putting in, when they talk about
unfortunately, although anybody can see that the number of people is in several ways connected dramatically to climate change. That is, the more people you have, the more greenhouse gases are produced. For example, about 35% of our greenhouse gases come from the food system. Curiously enough, the more people you have, the bigger the food system, and so on. But because of craziness in human culture, people refuse to recognize that numbers of people are a huge factor in climate change. The climate disruption is going to end up killing. It already is killing people with the heat waves and the fires, but that's going to get much, 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 much worse. And sadly, it's not faced. I met with a colleague who works with the IPCC, the international organization that looks at climate. And this lady she's a wonderful scientist, had a hell of a time getting population even mentioned in the IPCC report, even though everybody who works there knows perfectly well that population is one of the major problems.
Oh dear. Okay, well, that's sort of not exact. I sort of expected an answer a bit like that. So, hey, now can I talk briefly about this Convention for Biological Diversity? So my organization, Vita Sapien, has actually been accepted as observers for this COP15 event that's coming up now in Montreal. And they're talking about the Kunming Declaration. I have a copy of it where they're going to sign it off. And one of the parts of this declaration is to put aside 30% of the world's land mass for biodiversity conservation, national parks. Are you across all of this stuff?
Well, I'm not a great fan of saying how much of the earth we have to put aside and the various things that we have to do to save biodiversity. I'm totally in favor of all the groups, including I'm involved with several, that are struggling in various ways to protect biodiversity in some spots. But the main thing that is getting rid of biodiversity, the main thing is too many people consuming too much, creating too many poisonous chemicals that are everywhere and are in our bodies, as well as in the bodies of polar bears and so on and so forth. As long as you have growth maniacs running countries, as long as people think more is better, you're going to get rid of biodiversity. In other words, the basic problem is shrinking the scale of the human enterprise. Human beings and our domestic animals, mostly cows, make up something like 96% of the weight of mammals on the planet. The other 4% being the wild things, the wildlife that is disappearing at a rate that is horrifying, and not just the big animals, not just the elephants and the deer and the moose and so on and the bears. It's also the insects that we're utterly dependent on and which are disappearing at a horrifying rate. And so I'm greatly in favor of having meetings, publishing papers, talking about how much land should be put aside. While we talk about how much land is being put aside, the bulldozers are clearing biodiversity off of Australia, for example, which already has lost huge chunks of its marvelous biodiversity. And you still have moronic politicians who talk about a big Australia and want to see 50 million people or something living in a country that's already vastly overpopulated. And it's my favorite country. I mean, I'm a part-time Australian. I love Australia. I know the Australian birds better than I know the birds of North America. I'm dying. I'm in Oz withdrawal at the moment because we haven't been over to see our friends for almost 3 years. We're hoping to come back in October if we can handle the COVID and the travel at our age. Didn't mean to rant at you, but I'm working all the time on the loss of populations and what that means to us as human beings as we exterminate our only living relatives in the universe.
What's the can you give me some back into this insect apocalypse, the insect decline? What are some of the numbers?
For instance, I could send you literature on it, but one study, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was of flying insects in southern Germany in the last few decades. Half of them have disappeared or more. In some places, 90%. When I was a kid, which was, of course, about 500 years ago, when I drove around, when I drove to a bar at night when I was 17 in the eastern United States, I drive through a storm of moths. And when I get to the bar, around the neon sign on the bar would be moths and other insects in huge numbers. No more. When I did work just 30 or 40 years ago in Costa Rica with light traps, censusing insects, you could put up a sheet and get it covered, as I did in New Guinea, with bugs. They'd come into a light, and there would be hundreds and hundreds of species, each one with a different way it posed and held its wings and so on. No more, all gone. And of course, insects are at the base of many food chains. If you got rid of all the insects, you'd be wading around in feces because they take care of waste disposal for us. Many of them help us get the bad insects and keep them away. And of course, it's the pests that survive best because they have the biggest populations. So as we get rid of insects, it's the helpful and friendly ones we get rid of first. It's absolutely insane.
And what's now, if I remember correctly, that paper you're referring to in Germany, the sampling that they were doing was actually done in like a nature preserve area. Is that correct? So it wasn't actually just that it was showing that the population decline wasn't due specifically to urbanization or, you know, artificial light.
A lot of my favorite insects have gone away for two different reasons. I used to live in the Northeast of the United States, where they have wonderful big silkworm moths. I mean, with wing spreads of 6 inches or so, glorious things like the Luna moth and the Cecropia moth. And they've disappeared for two reasons. One is two pest moths were brought in from Europe, and the little fly they brought in to try and control them enjoys eating the silkworms as much as the pests. And the other thing is lights. Street lights attract them and they die before they get a chance to reproduce. And the whole change of our whole lightscape is affecting human beings as well in ways we're often not sure of, although one of the things that may be doing is helping the new epidemic we have of nearsightedness that may be related to that, or to the fact that kids now spend their time looking at screens that are only inches from their eyes, like you and I are doing right now.
Right now, yes. Hey,
We're too old to get nearsighted, though.
So can you speak to that artificial night sky brightness or sky glow? Because it's something that I take a particular interest in. I've got a plan to have an annual ceremony where you actually go out into like full dark, right, away from sky glow. And if you go and get the sky glow thing that you can add on to Google Earth, you can actually sort of map it out and see where it's dark. You've actually got to travel about 4 hours by car to get to full dark in Australia, from Brisbane. You've got to go.
I can believe it.
Yeah.
There are some wonderful outback places I've been to in fields looking for interesting birds. Right. And it is wonderful to get to a fully dark place. But of course, one of the things that's killing off birds in Australia and more so in North America is the lighted buildings that attract migrating birds.
Right.
Between pussycats, which of course are a huge factor in Australia and have eaten much of Australia's biodiversity, same thing in North America and Asia and Eurasia, but also the lighted buildings get rid of biodiversity. And it's obscure to me why we should create more greenhouse gases to keep unoccupied buildings lighted. We ought to learn to be peaceful enough that you don't have to, rob places so that people keep them lighted all night. It's insane. Again, why? If Linnaeus were here today, he'd never name us Homo sapiens again. We're not wise in any definition of the word.
No. What would it be? Homo ignoramus or Homo insanicus?
Or economicus, yeah.
Economicus.
I mean, after all, the financialization of people in the world is only a few hundred years old.
Yeah.
Our basic standard in the past, 400 years ago, a person who was rich didn't necessarily get political power. Got more than the poor did. But even then, there was a start on financialization. And that's the whole idea that some rich jerk who wants to fly a sports car to the moon has got some kind of brains or power just because he made a lot of money. And, you can just tell he's an imbecile. But we judge people by their salaries and by how much money they've accumulated, and we give them power. And it's a big mistake.
What's your reading on the state of the Great Barrier Reef?
My reading on the state of it is the same as my reading on coral reefs in general. And that is the kind that make reefs, the corals that make reefs are not long for this world if we continue on present course, because both warming the oceans and acidifying them screws up the corals. They're dependent in large degree on the algae that give them color to feed them, basically. They contribute to the algae and vice versa. It's a very famous mutualism, and it's breaking down. And I've worked on the Great Barrier Reef. I I tell anybody you really want to know biodiversity, don't go into a tropical rainforest because you won't see the birds. They're moving around too fast. They're too high up and so on. Go onto a coral reef. You don't even have to go down deep. You can just snorkel and you can see. I mean, I worked on butterflies on land, but I worked on butterfly fish on the Great Barrier Reef. Frank Talbot who's still going from the Australia, he was head of the Australian Museum. He got us models of coral reef butterfly fishes to test the idea that the colors of the fishes were territorial signals. And we found out when we put the models on lucite wands and showed them to the fish that they actually schooled on them. They weren't territorial signals. We had a great time, and there were 30 or so species of butterfly fishes alone that you could census on the reefs and see them in front of your eyes all the time. And those reefs are not long for this world, which is a huge tragedy aesthetically and of course biologically, because millions of poor people depend on the fishes of reefs for their protein. It's another horrifying and sad story.
Paul, you've been doing this stuff for what, 50 plus years now. When you first started in biology, were you aware that this collapse was taking place, or is that something that's crept up on you over your career?
No, it came later. I started around, I would say 1950, and it wasn't clear to me until the 70s what was happening. And we lost populations of butterflies I was studying. And both Ann and I and a guy named Norman Myers wrote books in the late 70s on extinction. And that's when it really came home to us. We knew the population problem was bad, but we did not have a clear view and the data to show that we were losing biodiversity at such a horrendous rate. And of course, in the early days of jet travel, I was able to do field work around the world. And I saw lots of places that were rich with biodiversity. And then 15 or 20 years later, when I got back to them, they were gone. In other words, I've actually seen it disappear here in the United States and in many places around the world, in New Guinea, in Costa Rica, in Australia. It's sad.
I just got my little 10-minute warning, so I've got to wrap this up just in a few minutes.
Well, we could sing a song. One of the things that I would like to emphasize, I think I sent you a paper on it. People have the idea that if we could only go back to 2015, that would be going back to normal. What people don't understand is that modern Homo sapiens, modern human beings, have something like a 300,000-year history. And for most of that history, they were cooperative, small group people, that there was no racism, there was much less sexism, there was much less economic inequality. The people who became the leaders were ones that were good at something. You didn't elect a deadbeat sex criminal as president of the United States. The person who led your hunts was the best hunter. The person who got people to cooperate was the best person at handling differences. The person who gave you medicine was the woman who knew all the plants. We were a very different species. When Europeans invaded North America, the North American indigenous people thought they were crazy. That they worked all the time and obeyed captains, and they weren't used to obeying anybody, and they lived rich lives. So the idea that what we ought to go back to is a super consuming world of 2015, just absent some of the really dull, dumb politicians, that's not a good idea. We need a whole new system and new people running it.
Yeah.
Sorry, I
And
didn't mean to give you a sermon that,
no. I come to you for sermons, Paul. You're the only guy I'd allow to give a sermon. But that late 70s, that's 50 years of insanity. I mean,
yeah,
you can create a problem, but when you realize there's a problem, that's when the insanity kicks in if you're doing nothing about it. And I've often
yeah.
thought that the real problem of climate and ecological collapse is not the
The
problem itself.
scientific community keeps warning and nobody listens.
Yeah.
In 1993, the World Scientific Academies and a huge group of scientists got together and warned that if humanity kept it up, we were screwed.
Yeah.
And it didn't even make the New York Times. I can still send it to you. And
Yeah.
it's been reinforced since.
Yeah.
Thousands of scientists have gotten together and said, we're overpopulated, we're destroying biodiversity, we're wrecking the climate. Nobody's paying attention.
Mm-hmm. All right. Okay. Let's leave it there, Paul. And maybe we can have another one of these really cheery conversations sometime down the track.
I'd be happy to. I have a new book coming out in January. I'd be happy to do it then or before.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Thanks, Paul. I really appreciate it.
It's nice talking to you. Thanks for doing it.
Okay. Bye-bye. Bye.
You take care.
Bye-bye.
And your listeners, be happy, live good lives, drink good wine, Aussie wine. Bye-bye.
Yeah.